Do you have other people read your works in progress?
Usually not. I mean, I'll give stuff to Ed. If I'm writing it myself,
so
I'll give it to him. And obviously when we work together, but usually I think it's kind of pointless until it's done, at least till I make my way through a draft to show people.
Do you ever look to other screenplays or writers or other writing media for inspiration?
Well, when I'm working, I actually am afraid to look at anything because I feel influenced by it. And you're working on a comedy and you see a tragedy and you think, oh well, that's a good piece of work. Why am I doing this piece of crap? I tend to try to stay away from things that will either influence me or distract me or upset me, while I'm actually writing. Now, I think in general our business is way too referential to other films, and I try not to do that.
In what way? How do you mean?
I think people, God, when you look at the submissions that come into a company, 90% of them are movies that just refer to other movies, that are just, basically rip-offs of something somebody else has done somehow. They just live in movie world as opposed to trying to talk about what happens in the real world, what happens between people, or what happens, in history or whatever. It's just, it's another story about a serial killer or this or that. And look, there have been great movies about serial killers, but for me, that's more about movies than about serial killers.
That's a good way to put it. I mean, where do you find inspiration then?
I find inspiration from different places. There's no one place. For instance, the thing I've done as an artist that I'm most proud of is a movie I directed, Dangerous Beauty. I just didn't write that. But that was something that I love very deeply, and even though it made very little money when it came out, has had this strange life in the culture and is now being turned into a musical, and people do seminars based on it, and it's got this whole sort of cult following of people who just happen to love that movie. And that was something that just came to our company. It was a biography, the first biography in English about this woman who lived in the 1500s in Venice, who was this world-famous courtesan and also the most brilliant poet of her time. And just like
Heidi
now,
Fleiss.
Just like Heidi Fleiss, exactly. If Heidi Fleiss were the most brilliant poet in America, people would not know what to do with her. And people did not know what to do with that woman either. And she led quite a remarkable life. And again, when it was first given to us, I didn't read the book. I mean, that was way too much for me at that moment. It was just somebody told me the story, and I said, oh, you mean she's a prostitute, a poet, she is put on trial by the Inquisition for witchcraft and is acquitted. I said, that's a movie I'm gonna make.
Yeah.
I just said, that's just great.
How can we miss, right?
Yeah.
Well, speaking of poetry and inspiration, we have a little inspiration exercise for you. We call it the object.
Uh-oh.
Frederick.
Oh, Lord.
Don't stress, it's okay.
No, I'm gonna...
Okay, the way this works is,
yes,
when I ask him to, Frederick's gonna pull the lid on the dome there.
Yeah.
There will be an object, a single object that we've chosen. It's completely random to you. And the exercise is that we want you to build whatever comes to mind, whatever story, character, whatever comes to mind out of this object, inspirationally. And then after you do that, we'll talk about maybe where those ideas came from.
Oh, Lord.
Okay?
Okay, sure.
Take your time with it.
Okay. All
Frederick, please.
Your object, sir.
You can take it off the tray there.
I know what it is. It's gaffer's tape.
But take it so Frederick.
Okay. All right.
Thank you, Frederick.
It's so not random to what we're talking about, because this is, a roll of gaffer's tape for me, it brings back all of film school, basically. And, I would say if I were going to take this, I would tell a story about two people falling in love on the set of a student film. And a group of film students have borrowed a friend's apartment, And the young director of the film is really attracted to the girl who owns the apartment. And while he's trying to make the film and dealing with all of the unbelievable difficulties in making a student film, you know, people not showing up, the car not working, that sort of thing, he's trying to flirt with this girl whose apartment it is. And of course, he's kind of caught between trying to do a good job in the movie and trying to get in good with the girl. And of course, it ends up being some terrible mess at the end. And out of the mess, you know, they actually create a real connection.
Ah,
That's
so
a story I would tell from. It's a love story, yeah.
Ah, very well done. Very well done. It brings up a question of like details in your scripts.
Yes.
To sort of bring realness to the scenes and the characters.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever do exercises like that, or you know, look around your workspace, or just playing off the inspiration question?
Mm-hmm.
How do you build things into your script to sort of anchor it, like real world objects and things like that? Do you do anything like that?
What Ed and I do all the time is basically talk and talk and talk about the reality of the situation that we're talking about. We will say, if we were there, or if you were going through that, what would be your day? What would be the things you'd have to deal with? What would your life be like? How would you know, I mean, if it's a story set in New York City, we would say, what are the cafes that you go to? Who are the people you know? Where do you go for the weekend? What's the texture of your life? If it's, you know, if it's Japan in the 1870s, we would talk a great deal about what the texture of daily life was in that village. We just spend a lot of time talking about, it's funny, when we had our deal at MGM, the guy running MGM at that time was this wonderful old sort of TV legend named David Gerber, who was a producer in the 70s. He produced that series Policewoman and a lot of things. And by then he was running the studio. And Gerber was famous for mangling the English language, also for profanity. But I remember one of the early scripts I wrote for him, it was not my idea. I was hired to write this, but it was similar to Lost, as a matter of fact. It was a pilot for a series where a bunch of teenagers have, been shipwrecked on a desert island, and they have to make their way there. And I had started to work out the story, and they were immediately squabbling as soon as they got on the beach. And Gerber, he says, well, they would be trying to figure out, like, are they okay, and where are they going to get food, and where the shelter is. I mean, that's human behaviorism. So ever since then, that expression, human behaviorism, is something we say, once a week. What's the human behaviorism here? And he was right. He was brilliant. It's like you have to think about what would people do in that situation. And a lot of story will come just from that conversation.
And this is long before the writing. I mean, this is you're working all this out.
Long before. You're trying to figure out the landscape of that story.
How do you deal with studio notes? What's your approach to that? Has that evolved over time?
I am as resentful of studio notes as any writer. But I generally feel that it's funny, long before we made Last Samurai, both Ed and I have had this affinity with Japanese culture and with the samurai mentality. And we have often said that directing movies is a samurai job, which is to say you are responsible. There are no excuses. And I think that's true of everything you do as a grown-up. And I tend to feel that if I'm doing my job right, there won't be any notes, and there won't be any objections to what I'm doing. And
how does that work out?
Well, the thing is, I know I can never do that, but that's where I start from in some sense. Or another way to look at it that I've often seen in my mind is if there is a vacuum in what you're doing somewhere, people will rush in to fill the vacuum with their own ideas. If you have executed it correctly, they will just go with what you're doing in some way. So when I get notes from anybody, I figure I must have done something wrong or some incomplete thing for this person to be having these ideas. So what I do is I try to look at what they've given me as a doctor would look at symptoms in a patient. You know, I don't say they have the right answer, but they are pointing to some problem that I may be having. And so, you know, I try to sort of take responsibility in that way.
So have you actually found notes helpful from studio execs?
Well, I have found them to be diagnostically helpful, which is to say they point to where I have problems. They don't give me good answers. I mean,
Right.
you know, hardly ever do they give me good answers. And when they do give me good answers, I'm very grateful to them and I tell them. But mostly I ignore their suggestions, but I don't ignore their complaints.
What's the oddest note that you've ever gotten? Can you think of on what
Lord.
project and you know, a direction they wanted you to take it in, or just something
There was
idiotic?
one project where they wanted me to turn a man into a woman for something, and it was so bizarre. I can't remember what it was, though. That's not very helpful to you.
Well,
Sorry.
no, I just thought sometimes those are instructive and humorous.
The oddest note I've ever gotten. You know, I would have to pay attention to them more in specifics to be able to remember something like that.
Right. Let me ask about Traffic. That you can explain the scenario for me, but from what I understand, you and Ed were working on a similar project, or you had hired Gagan.
We had hired. Actually, this was
How did
mostly
that play
Ed.
out?
Ed had always wanted to do a dark comedy about the war on drugs, and he hired Steve to do that. And it just took a very long time to work it out. And Steve had not even started writing the screenplay yet. He was still working on the story.
Right. Well, this was a difficult period for Steve.
It was a difficult period, yes. Yeah, that's for him to talk about. But it was a difficult period. And in the midst of that, Steve got a call from his agent that Soderbergh wanted to meet him. So he went into Soderbergh's office, and Soderbergh proceeds to tell him that he wants to do a movie about the war on drugs. And so a half hour later, Ed gets this panicked phone call from Gagan saying, Soderbergh wants to do the same movie. And at that point, Ed felt so stalled with Steve and the story and all that, and there were other things going on. Ed picked up the phone, called Soderbergh. They had never met. He said, I'm calling you because you had this meeting, whatever, and I think maybe we should just work on it together. Soderbergh said, done. That was it. It was a very short conversation.
This is not a common occurrence, though,
No,
because
not at
that
all.
shows quite a level of generosity amongst.
Well, look, both of us had loved Soderbergh's work, and we were really intrigued to work with him, and it just seemed at that moment, I think Ed was a grown-up in the sense that he saw that although they had done a lot of good work, most of which was incorporated into the film, by the way, they still hadn't solved the problems yet. So it just seemed like the thing to do at that moment.
How do you, as a writer yourself, how do you deal with a writer that's working for you as a producer? I mean, how do you balance how involved to get?
It's very
because
hard.
From being a writer, you know, you don't want anybody to touch your stuff.
Yeah.
How do you balance that? How does that play out?
It's the hardest thing for me. Actually, the hardest thing for me is to work with directors who are having trouble, because I never want to sort of intervene in a director's process, because I wouldn't want that done to me. So that's the hardest thing for me. The second hardest is working with writers. The thing is that in general, what we have found is that writers are very happy to work with us because we're writers. That it's much harder for a writer to work with a producer who doesn't understand the process of writing. So in general, writers have been extremely open to our participation in the process with them. But look, people always disagree. That just happens, and sometimes there are disagreements, and it's very, very hard for me to assert my will over an artist. It's just not in my nature to do that. And I would say there have been several projects that we have begun that basically just fell apart. When I say fell apart, I mean just never became what they should have become, because we just didn't have enough of the taste for the jugular to force the writer to do what we felt they should do.
Interesting.
If they couldn't do it sort of willingly and happily, we didn't know how to make them do it. That just felt too strange.
Well, when you're a writer and you've spent all this time on a screenplay and developed it, what happens when like a big, kind of large personality actor becomes attached to the project, like Tom Cruise, for example? How does that affect the writing? Do you end up having to tweak things based on ideas they bring to it, or
Yeah.
do you have examples of how that?
It's funny, in the Tom situation, it was actually a great experience. And I can't remember having a bad experience in that regard, but Tom was certainly the biggest star we had ever worked with.
Right.
And we had a lot of trepidation about that. And, you know, he turned out to be just spot on. I mean, both Ed and I really enjoyed, actually, the whole process of working with Tom.
Really?
It was the opposite of what we expected. Tom was, first of all, very smart about story. He was extremely non-narcissistic about talking about the movie. In other words, most actors truly will only be concerned with their character.
Right.
They can't help it in some way. And Tom was perfectly capable, in fact, most interested in talking about what the movie was as a whole and what we were trying to accomplish with the movie. And then he could also talk about his issues with his character. And he had a lot of issues with his character. And he led us in a direction that turned out to be quite good for us and really challenged us. And I thought made it much better in some way.
Can you be specific?
Yeah.
What was the?
Yeah.
How did things evolve once he came?
He felt that Algren, as we originally wrote him, was a very tortured man who was very quiet, very silent, and in some way unknowable, and also in some way passive. And Tom kept saying,
Actors don't like that.
well, they don't like that, it's
Right.
true. But movies don't really like that either. And Tom kept saying to us, I don't mind that he's fucked up. I love that he's fucked up. Make him more fucked up. I don't want to look good. I don't care about that. You know, he's drunk. It's great. That's all great. But I don't know how to play something that internal. Give me something to do. Let me be fucked up. Let me act fucked up. And so we found ways to externalize this behavior that made the story more dynamic and much more fun to write, and told the exact same story we were trying to tell.
Why do you think it's difficult to make good movies? Let me put it this way. If there was something you could change about the system, what would you change from a screenwriting standpoint?
Oh, boy.
And keep in mind, we only have 3 hours.
Look, I'm not the first person to say this. I think the business is being strangled by the corporate mentality that now runs it. And it's being strangled by the crazy system we have of movies being so expensive to make and so difficult for the people to make them to make a profit on them. So that all decisions on movies then are based on fear by the executives who are making those decisions. Fear for their own jobs and fear in terms of the bottom line of their company. And that this infects every aspect of the filmmaking process when you're at a studio. And all the movies I've made have basically been studio movies. I can't really speak about the indie world, but I'm sure as hell getting closer to going into it, because I think that it's getting harder and harder to be creative in the movie world. Movies are now these big aircraft carriers, you know, that have to be all things to all people. It's very hard to make, you know, a little destroyer or a PT boat of a movie. It's got to be an aircraft carrier. It's got to be this big thing that appeals to all four quadrants, you know, men and women under 25, over 25, that sort of thing. All they're concerned about now is the opening weekend. And that determines what the movie has to be. And that's why they're making movies from 1960s television shows and remakes and all that, because at least they think there's a built-in audience that knows what that is and that might be interested. You know, they're tearing their hair out. How do you get a $20 million opening weekend on a movie? Well, people gotta really want to see it, gotta know what it is. You know, it's a very difficult thing to accomplish. And it's just the death of us as far as I'm concerned.
Does this fear mentality also explain why they will bring on 4, 5, 6 writers in the development stage? I mean, you probably don't experience that as much because you guys have such a reputation at this point.
Well, I've been in those situations. You know, I did a rewrite once where I was one of 6 writers, and
what's that like? I mean, what
I think, again, usually that's a situation where something's not working and they just keep throwing it against the wall and hoping somebody will figure out how to make it work.
Does that ever happen? I mean, do you
Well,
feel like
we
that?
hear stories. I mean, I think Tootsie had 1 million writers on it and turned out to be great. I mean,
Really?
I
I
do
didn't
think
know that.
once in a while, somebody will come in with an inspiration and will turn something around and make it work. I mean, look, the idea of having a lot of writers on something goes way, way back. You know, It's a Wonderful Life had 4 or 5 writers on it. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad movie, and they've been doing it literally since the early 30s. So I think that's just endemic to this business. I think it's because the movie business is not a writer-driven medium. The television business is, but movies are not writer-driven. And
Right. Well, in TV,
so,
the writers are the showrunners,
Yeah.
and they have a lot more creative control over
yeah,
it. Yeah.
yeah.
What's been the most frustrating thing about being a screenwriter?
Again, I see myself as a filmmaker, which is to say I do whatever is necessary on any particular movie. So I don't really delineate myself as screenwriter, director, producer. You know, it all blends together for me. And I think the most frustrating part of all of it is just the terrible struggle to get a movie made. You know, you have a vision, you have to deal with people who don't have vision, they have say in what you're doing, then you finish the screenplay, then other people without vision tell you who you can cast it with, and if you can't get that person, then you can't do the, you know, it's just this, it's this, you know, boulder. You're just pushing up a hill, up a hill, up a hill. At any moment, it can, you know, the whole thing could just fall apart. It is that sense of not being able to pursue the thing you love that is so frustrating about this business.
Well, what's the best piece of advice or insight that you've received that's helped with your writing?
I had good teachers, like I said, who taught me to be absolutely ruthless with my own material. Ed calls it killing your children. That many writers, when you ask them to rewrite, will hold on to the lines they love and sort of twist the whole scene around so they can keep the things they like and fit the new stuff in some way. And I don't believe in that. You can't do that. You have to come from plenty. You have to come from abundance. You have to say, well, if I had that good idea, I can have another good idea. And you have to just address what needs to be done in the story in this ruthless manner, which says that I can make it work, you know, I can make it better, and I don't have to be precious with myself.
Well, that's a faith that self-loathing writers generally struggle to find.
Yeah, they do. It's true. But you have to. You have to really believe that there's more where that came from.
Well, tell us what's next for you. What do you got coming up? What are you trying to get accomplished?
I'm actually gearing up right now to do a pilot directly for the internet. There was a pilot that I had at one of the networks, and I wasn't happy with the direction they wanted to take it in. So I went to the production company and I said, let's not do it for the network. Let's do it directly for the internet. I know we have to do it for $1.50, but at least I can do it the way I want to do it. This is something that I wrote that I'm very proud of and really believe in. And so in a few weeks, I'll be sort of back to student film land, you know,
Wow.
with no budget. And I absolutely can't wait. I'm totally excited.
Well, that's great. I really want to thank you for being with us, Marshall.
Thank you. Thanks.
And thank you for being here as well. Be sure to check out the other great interviews with industry pros in the series. And remember, it all starts with you. The next written by credit could be yours. I'm Jay Fernandez.